don't let her through." Harrison Vale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In front of the flashing cameras, the velvet ropes, and the polished marble steps of the Winter Legacy Gala, his quiet command was enough to make 2 security guards step directly into Vivian Sterling's path. For one frozen second, the crowd thought it was a mistake. Then Harrison turned, adjusted his tuxedo cuff, and looked at his wife with the kind of cold smile that only came from years of private cruelty practiced in public ready ways. "She's not with me tonight," he said smoothly, loud enough for the nearest reporters to hear. "There seems to be some confusion." A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because wealthy people had a way of teaching a room when to laugh. Vivian stood at the edge of the red carpet in a dark silver gown she had chosen 3 years ago and never had the chance to wear. Her hands stayed calm at her sides, but inside, something old and sacred was breaking. She had spent 20 years helping Harrison build the polished life, now glittering around him, and tonight he was erasing her with one sentence. Beside him, Celeste Rowan slipped her hand lightly onto his arm, elegant and unbothered, her diamond earrings catching the light. She did not smirk. She didn't have to. Her victory was already standing in plain sight. A reporter leaned forward. "Mr. Vale, is this your new partner for the foundation?" Harrison gave the perfect pause, the one designed to wound more than any answer. Vivian felt every eye on her, pity from some, curiosity from others, pleasure from the cruelest in the crowd. And somewhere behind her she heard one camera shutter keep firing, hungry for the exact moment a discarded wife realized the world had moved on without her. Then came the sound, not applause, not gossip, an engine. A long black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to the curb and stopped directly in front of Vivian. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and said 5 words that turned Harrison's face completely white. "Ms. Sterling, the board is waiting." For a moment, nobody moved. The cameras that had just been pointed at Vivian in pity now swung toward the Rolls-Royce like sunflowers turning to light. Even the reporters seemed to forget their questions. The only sound was the soft purr of the engine and the sharp winter wind moving across the red carpet. Vivian didn't step forward right away. She stood perfectly still, staring at the driver in his black coat and white gloves, at the small silver crest on the car door, at the seal she had not seen in years but knew instantly. Sterling. Her family name, not Harrison's, not the foundation's public brand, hers. Behind her, someone whispered, "Why would that car come for her?" Another voice answered, "Wait, Ms. Sterling?" Harrison recovered first, or tried to. He stepped down from the carpet with a smile that looked painfully stitched together. "There's been some misunderstanding," he said, reaching for Vivian's elbow like a loving husband trying to protect his wife from embarrassment. "My wife has had a difficult few months." Vivian looked at his hand until he slowly pulled it back. The driver did not acknowledge Harrison. He simply held out a cream envelope embossed with the Sterling crest. "Ma'am, this was delivered under board instruction. You are requested upstairs immediately." Celeste's expression changed for the first time. It was small, almost invisible, but Vivian caught it. Not fear yet. Calculation. The quick mental scramble of someone realizing the script had changed without warning. A reporter took 2 eager steps closer. "Mrs. Sterling, are you on the board?" No one answered. Vivian accepted the envelope with steady fingers, though her pulse was beating hard in her throat. The paper felt heavy, official, familiar. For one strange second, she was no longer standing outside a gala beside the husband who had just humiliated her. She was 26 again in her father's study, learning that silence was not the same thing as surrender. She broke the seal. Inside was a single card and one folded legal page. Her eyes landed on the first line, and all the noise around her disappeared. By authority of the Sterling Family Trust, emergency succession protocol has been activated. Vivian lifted her gaze slowly. Harrison had gone pale. Celeste's hand slipped from his arm, and at the top of the hotel stairs, beneath the golden lights of the gala entrance, Vivian saw one more familiar face waiting for her, the man Harrison had fired 12 years ago for knowing too much. Then Gideon Cross gave her a slight nod, as if to say, "It's time." 16 years earlier, before the diamonds, before the gala headlines, before Harrison Vale learned how to make cruelty sound like good manners, Vivian Sterling was the woman people remembered when she left a room. She was 28, sharp-minded, graceful under pressure, and already known in Manhattan's charity circuit as the strategist who could turn a failing fundraiser into the event everyone talked about for months. She understood donors, timing, seating charts, press angles, and something even more valuable than money. She understood pride. She knew exactly how to make powerful people feel admired, needed, and unforgettable. That was how she met Harrison. He wasn't the polished public figure he would later become. Back then, he was handsome in a rougher way, ambitious, restless, still fighting for doors that did not open easily. His investment firm was small, unstable, and one bad quarter away from being quietly buried by stronger men with older names. They met at a museum benefit where the keynote speaker cancelled an hour before guests arrived. Harrison was there hoping to impress two major donors. Vivian, brought in to rescue the evening, rewrote the flow of the event in under 10 minutes, reassigned the speaking order, charmed an angry sponsor, and somehow made the disaster look intentional. Harrison watched all of it with open admiration. Later, while staff cleared champagne glasses and folded linen napkins, he found her alone near the service hall, slipping off her heels for relief. "You saved the entire night," he told her. Vivian smiled, tired but warm. "No, I saved the people who needed the night to look perfect." He laughed then, and it was real. Not the practiced laugh he used now, but something younger, honest, almost grateful. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "Preferably before my entire career catches fire." He called the next morning. Flowers arrived that afternoon. 3 weeks later, he was telling people she was the smartest woman he had ever met. And for a while, he meant it. Vivian helped him reshape his image, refine his speeches, choose the right causes, win over skeptical investors, and step into rooms that once ignored him. She softened his rough edges, built the foundation of his public reputation, and never once asked to stand in the spotlight beside him. She thought she was building a marriage. She didn't realize she was building a throne. And years later, standing outside that gala with a legal document in her hand, Vivian finally understood the most dangerous mistake she had ever made. She had taught Harrison how power worked before she knew he would one day use it against her. At first, Harrison didn't erase Vivian with one cruel act. He did it slowly, the way water wears down stone. The first time, it almost sounded harmless. They were at a private dinner with investors in Tribeca, only a year into the marriage, when one of the men complimented the foundation's press strategy. Vivian had spent 2 weeks shaping that campaign, choosing the language, the guest list, even the order of the speeches. Before she could answer, Harrison smiled and lifted his wine glass. "I'm lucky," he said. "Vivian keeps our home beautiful so I can stay focused on the real work." Everyone laughed softly. Vivian laughed too, because correcting him in public felt too sharp, too small, too unnecessary. Later that night, she mentioned it in the car. "You made it sound like I do nothing," she said. Harrison kept his eyes on the road. "Don't be dramatic. I was being gracious." That became his favorite word, gracious. When he forgot to mention her in interviews, he was being gracious. When he removed her name from planning documents, he was simplifying things. When he started taking Celeste Rowan to meetings Vivian used to attend, he said Vivian deserved rest, privacy, peace. And when Vivian objected, Harrison would lower his voice, touch her wrist gently, and make her sound unreasonable even to herself. "You've been tired lately. You're too sensitive. You always hear insult where there isn't one." The worst part was how believable he made it sound. Over time, invitations stopped arriving in Vivian's name. Florists called Celeste instead of her. Donors began saying, "Harrison has built something extraordinary," while Vivian stood 2 feet away, smiling, like a woman looking at her own portrait after someone else signed it. Then came the smaller humiliations. A table card changed at the last minute, and Vivian was seated with distant sponsors while Celeste sat beside Harrison. A magazine profile described Vivian as a reserved spouse with little interest in public life. A charity auction video used 3 of Vivian's ideas and credited Harrison's executive team. Every time she noticed, Harrison had an explanation ready. Every time she doubted herself, Naomi told her to stay calm, stay elegant, stay patient, so Vivian did. Until one afternoon, while looking for a receipt in Harrison's study, she found a draft guest list for the Winter Legacy Gala. Next to Harrison's name was Celeste Rowan. Next to Vivian's name were 2 words written in neat black ink, "Not attending." And for the first time, Vivian realized this wasn't neglect anymore, it was planning. Celeste Rowan never arrived like a scandal, she arrived like a solution. The first time Vivian saw her, she was standing beside a floral mock-up in the foundation office, dressed in cream silk with a tablet in one hand, and a calm smile that made everyone around her feel slightly less organized. Harrison introduced her casually. "Celeste is helping streamline public image before the donor season." Helping. That was the word he used when he wanted to hide an invasion. Celeste shook Vivian's hand with perfect warmth. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "Your taste built half this foundation's identity." It should have sounded respectful. Instead, it felt like someone admiring a house before replacing the owner. At first, Celeste played the role beautifully. She deferred to Vivian in meetings, praised her instincts, even asked for advice on donor wives, color palettes, and seating politics. She was careful. She never took too much too fast. She let other people decide she belonged. And they did. Within 3 months, Celeste was copied on every foundation email. Within 5, she was approving press drafts before Vivian ever saw them. Within 7, people stopped asking Vivian what she thought and started asking Celeste what Vivian would prefer. The cruelty was in the elegance of it. Celeste never insulted Vivian directly. She simply made her seem outdated. She prefers quieter roles. She's not comfortable with all this visibility. She's been under a lot of emotional strain. We want to protect her. Protect her from what? Her own life? Then came the first public shift. At a fall luncheon, a photographer waved Celeste closer to Harrison and said, "You two have great event chemistry." Celeste laughed softly, as though embarrassed. Harrison didn't correct him. Vivian stood 3 feet away, holding the program she had personally rewritten that morning. That night, Naomi told her not to overreact. "It's just optics," Naomi said over tea in Vivian's kitchen. "Young donors respond to polished women like Celeste. Harrison's trying to keep the foundation modern." Modern. Vivian repeated that word to herself later in bed, staring into the dark while Harrison showered in the next room. Modern was the excuse. Modern was how they made betrayal sound efficient. But the truth revealed itself a week later. Vivian arrived early to the townhouse after lunch and heard voices in Harrison's study. She stopped when she heard Celeste laughing, low and familiar. Then Harrison spoke, amused and careless. "Give it another month," he said. "By the gala, everyone will think she stepped aside on her own." Vivian didn't breathe. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, because in that moment she understood something worse than an affair. Celeste wasn't stealing her husband. They were rehearsing her disappearance. Naomi Pierce had been in Vivian's life so long that betrayal wore her face more convincingly than love ever could. They had met at a hospital fundraiser 14 years earlier, back when Vivian still believed kindness created loyalty. Naomi had been funny, observant, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, sent handwritten notes, and always knew when to call just before a difficult dinner or a lonely weekend. When Vivian's mother died, Naomi arrived before the flowers. When Vivian suffered her miscarriage, Naomi was the only friend who sat beside her without asking for words. That was why Vivian trusted her. That was why Harrison chose her. 3 days after Vivian overheard Harrison and Celeste in the study, Naomi came over carrying lemon scones from Vivian's favorite bakery, and concern arranged carefully across her face. "You look exhausted," Naomi said, setting the box on the marble counter. "What's he done now?" Vivian wanted to say everything. The guest list, Celeste, the whispers, the feeling that her marriage was being peeled away from her in layers so thin no one else would ever call it violence. Instead, she said, "I think Harrison is trying to remove me from the foundation." Naomi did not look surprised enough. She sighed, sat down, and reached into her leather tote. "Then listen to me carefully. You need to stop reacting emotionally and protect yourself on paper." She placed a thin stack of documents on the kitchen island. Vivian frowned. "What is this?" "Temporary restructuring," Naomi said. "Nothing dramatic. It limits your liability while the press team cleans up the donor confusion. If Celeste is moving too aggressively, this keeps your name safe until things settle." The pages were dense, full of legal language and foundation terminology. Vivian scanned phrases without fully absorbing them. Advisory role, voluntary withdrawal from day-to-day operations, temporary transfer of signing authority. "I don't like this," Vivian said quietly. Naomi leaned forward, her voice soft with practiced urgency. "Then don't think of it as surrender. Think of it as strategy. Sign now, regain control later, but if a scandal hits first, Harrison will say you refused every reasonable option." That landed exactly where Naomi meant it to. Vivian picked up the pen, then stopped. For the first time in years, she looked past Naomi's soothing tone and saw something cold beneath it. Not concern, timing. "Who drafted these?" Vivian asked. Naomi hesitated just a second too long. Then Vivian turned to the final page and saw the law firm name at the bottom. It wasn't hers. It wasn't neutral. It was the same firm Harrison used to bury people without ever getting his hands dirty. The scandal didn't explode all at once. It leaked with precision. 2 mornings after Naomi brought the documents, Vivian woke to 6 missed calls, 11 text messages, and a headline she read twice before her mind accepted the words: Foundation, funds under review after internal irregularities. Her name was in the second paragraph, not Harrison's, not Celeste's, hers. The article never used the word theft. It didn't need to. It used cleaner, deadlier language, misallocated records, signature discrepancies, unclear reimbursement approvals tied to charitable outreach under Vivian Sterling's oversight. By the time she reached the bottom, she understood exactly what they were doing. They were not accusing her of a crime yet. They were preparing the public to believe one. Harrison was already dressed when she came downstairs, standing in the breakfast room with his phone in hand and a look of controlled disappointment that made her want to shatter every window in the house. "I was just about to come up," he said. "We need to handle this carefully." Vivian held up the article. "You knew?" He didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Celeste entered seconds later, carrying a folder and wearing navy like she was headed to a funeral she had organized herself. "The board is concerned," she said gently. "They think it would be best if you stepped back until the review is complete." Vivian stared at her. "You mean until the lie hardens?" Celeste lowered her eyes, performing hurt for an audience of one. Harrison stepped closer. "No one is calling you a liar, but perception matters. If you cooperate, this can stay private." Private. Vivian almost laughed. An hour later, it was nowhere near private. Her usual florist cancelled an event consultation. A donor's wife unfollowed her, then posted a vague quote about integrity. A charity blog published an anonymous comment claiming Vivian had been unstable for years. By noon, even her anxiety treatment from years earlier was being whispered about, as if grief itself were proof of guilt. And through it all, Naomi kept texting, "Don't panic, say nothing, let the professionals fix it." That was when Vivian finally understood the shape of the trap. They wanted her silent because silence would look like shame. They wanted her frightened because fear signed papers faster than logic ever could. So she did the one thing none of them expected. She stopped answering everyone. Then she went upstairs, unlocked the last drawer in her father's old writing desk, and pulled out the sealed envelope she had never dared to open. Because if they were ready to bury her name, Vivian was finally ready to uncover theirs. The envelope had been waiting for 8 years in the back of her father's writing desk beneath old stationery, cancelled checks and a fountain pen that no longer worked. Vivian had touched it dozens of times after his death, but never opened it. Grief had made some things feel sacred, and some truths felt too heavy to survive. Now her hands were steady. The paper was yellowed at the corners, sealed with dark red wax, pressed with the Sterling crest. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter from her father, a notarized trust amendment, and a business card with one name embossed in deep black lettering: Gideon Cross. Vivian read the first line of her father's letter and sat down slowly. If you are reading this, then someone has either betrayed you, publicly dishonored you, or tried to separate you from what is yours by making you doubt yourself first. Her throat tightened. The letter was not emotional. It was precise, almost frighteningly so. Her father wrote that he had seen Harrison's ambition early. He had admired it once, even respected it, but never fully trusted it. Years before his death, he had quietly restructured part of the Sterling family trust, not to punish Vivian, to protect her from the exact kind of polished ruin a man like Harrison might one day attempt. The trust amendment explained everything Harrison had worked so hard to keep hidden: the foundation's prestige accounts, the donor network access, and even the use of the Sterling crest at major public events were not permanently controlled by Harrison's board. They were conditional privileges tied to Vivian's standing as the direct Sterling heir. If she were publicly displaced through fraud, coercion, or reputational manipulation, emergency succession protocol could be triggered immediately. That was the card now sitting in her hand, not luck, not coincidence. A trapdoor built years ago by the one man who had known she might someday need a way back up. Vivian turned the card over and found a handwritten note on the back in her father's unmistakable script. "Only call him when you are done begging people to love you fairly." She closed her eyes for one painful second. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the number. Gideon answered on the second ring, like a man who had been expecting this call for years. "Ms. Sterling," he said quietly. Vivian looked toward the window where the city lights were coming on one by one like witnesses. "This is Vivian," she said. "Tell me exactly how to take everything back." And after a brief silence, Gideon gave her the first instruction that would bring Harrison's world to its knees. Gideon's first instruction was simple. "Do not defend yourself publicly," he said. "Not yet. Let them keep speaking. Every lie they tell without resistance becomes evidence of intent." Vivian stood in the dark of her father's study, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the calm voice of the man Harrison had once called dangerous. She understood now why. Gideon did not sound angry, he sounded prepared. By sunrise the next morning, a black car arrived outside the townhouse. No press markings, no foundation logo, just a driver, a sealed portfolio, and Gideon Cross waiting inside a private office 6 blocks from the courthouse. He looked exactly as she remembered from years ago. Dark suit, silver at the temples, unreadable expression. But when Vivian entered, he stood at once, not with pity, not with surprise, but with the kind of respect she had not felt in years. "You came alone," he said. "I've spent too long being outnumbered," Vivian replied. For the first time, one corner of Gideon's mouth moved, almost a smile. He opened the portfolio. Inside were copies of trust agreements, donor covenants, property attachments, and board memoranda Vivian had never been allowed to see. One by one, Gideon laid them out across the table until Harrison's empire stopped looking like a kingdom and started looking like borrowed furniture. "The penthouse is not his," Gideon said. Vivian stared. "What?" "It was purchased through a holding structure tied to the Sterling family trust. Harrison has occupancy rights through marriage, not ownership. If succession protocol holds, he loses access." Her pulse jumped. Gideon slid over a second document. "Neither does he control the foundation name in perpetuity. He licenses it through your inherited position. Remove that position, and he becomes a man hosting a gala in a costume someone else paid for." Vivian sat very still. Years of humiliation did not vanish in that room, but they rearranged themselves. Every insult, every missing signature, every time Harrison made her feel disposable, it had all depended on one thing: her silence. "What about Celeste?" Vivian asked. Gideon handed her a final file. Inside were travel reimbursements, private messages, media payments, and one unsigned engagement proposal drafted by Harrison's office but never filed. Celeste had not been promised love. She had been promised access. Vivian looked up slowly. "So neither of them knows the truth?" "No," Gideon said. "They only know the version that benefits them." Then he closed the last folder and met her eyes. "Which is why tonight Harrison will host his grandest gala, believing he is untouchable, while every flaw beneath him is already gone." By 7:30 that night, Harrison Vale believed he had already won. The ballroom of the Winter Legacy Gala shimmered in gold and crystal, every table set like a promise of wealth that would never run out. Reporters lined the entrance. Donors filled the room. String music floated beneath the low, satisfied hum of people who liked being seen almost as much as they liked being admired. At the center of it all stood Harrison, flawless in a black tuxedo, smiling as if the scandal around Vivian had already settled into accepted truth. That was the brilliance of his plan. He had not destroyed her in one loud, ugly moment. He had done it politely, through headlines, whispers, legal language, and carefully timed concern. By the time the gala began, most people no longer asked whether Vivian had been pushed out. They asked whether she had stepped away because of stress, instability, or guilt. And Harrison encouraged every version. When a donor's wife tilted her head and asked softly, "How is Vivian holding up?" he gave a solemn pause and answered, "She needs privacy right now. I only want what protects her dignity." It was the kind of sentence that sounded merciful while burying someone alive. Beside him, Celeste Rowan wore deep emerald silk and the expression of a woman already being measured for a crown. She moved through the ballroom with quiet confidence, greeting sponsors, touching elbows, finishing Harrison's sentences at exactly the right moments. Twice that evening, people mistook her for his future wife. Neither of them corrected it. At 8:15, Harrison took the stage. He thanked the board, the donors, the city, the press, and every loyal supporter of the foundation. Then he shifted his tone, lower and more intimate, the voice he used when he wanted a room to lean in. "Tonight," he said, "is about legacy, about knowing when to move forward with strength, clarity, and the right people beside you." A murmur passed through the room. Celeste lifted her chin. Near the back, Naomi stood frozen with a champagne glass in her hand, waiting for the public announcement she had been promised would secure all their futures. Then Harrison reached into his jacket pocket. Not for a speech card, for a ring box. And in that exact moment, before he could say another word, every screen in the ballroom went black. The music stopped. The chandeliers dimmed for one sharp, breathless second. Then the first image appeared above the stage. It was not a proposal slide, it was a Sterling family trust document with Harrison's name highlighted in red. A gasp rolled through the ballroom like a sudden crack in ice. Harrison stood under the stage lights, the velvet ring box still open in his hand, while the giant screen behind him displayed page after page of legal language no one in the room fully understood yet, but everyone understood enough. His name was there. Vivian's name was there. And above both of them, in formal black lettering, were the words, "Sterling Family Trust." Celeste's smile vanished first. She turned toward Harrison, waiting for him to laugh it off, to wave a hand, to say there had been some absurd technical error. But Harrison didn't move. For the first time all night, his face had gone still in the wrong way, not controlled, not polished, cornered. The next slide appeared, a trust clause, highlighted lines, conditional use of the Sterling name, crest, and associated donor privileges, valid only through lawful marital standing and good faith governance. Then another, emergency succession protocol activated upon evidence of coercion, reputational sabotage, or fraudulent displacement of the primary heir. The room changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, donors leaning back instead of forward, reporters lowering their glasses of champagne and lifting their phones. Board members no longer looking at Vivian like a liability, but at Harrison like a man who had just walked into his own trap in front of 200 witnesses. And then Vivian stepped into the ballroom. She did not rush, she did not speak. She simply walked through the center aisle in a silver-grey gown, shoulders straight, eyes calm, with Gideon Cross beside her, carrying a dark leather portfolio. Every head turned. The same people who had watched her humiliation outside now parted without being asked. Harrison recovered just enough to force a smile. "Vivian," he said, voice tight but still trying for charm. "This is not the place for confusion." Gideon stopped at the foot of the stage. "Actually, he said, as this is the perfect place. The board requested a full clarification in the presence of all major donors." A board member near the front stood abruptly. "Is this document authentic?" Gideon handed over the original file. "It is," he said, "and unless Mr. Vale can produce evidence that he lawfully controls the Sterling-linked assets and board authority independent of his wife, his leadership status is now under immediate review." Naomi dropped her champagne glass. Celeste took one slow step away from Harrison. And Vivian, standing beneath the chandelier light that had once made her feel invisible, finally raised her eyes to her husband. Then she said the one sentence Harrison never believed he would hear from her in public. "Everything you built with my name ends tonight." The silence after Vivian's words lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough to change the balance of the room. Then the questions began, not from reporters first, but from the donors. The old money kind, the kind who never raised their voices because they never had to. A silver-haired woman at table 3 stood and asked, "Harrison, did you know these assets were conditionally tied to Mrs. Sterling?" A man from the East Side board followed with something colder. "And did you allow this room to believe she was the one under investigation?" Harrison finally moved. He snapped the ring box shut, set it down, and forced out a laugh that landed like broken glass. "This is a marital dispute being turned into theatre," he said. "Vivian is upset, Mr. Cross is exploiting outdated documents, and I would advise everyone here not to overreact." Celeste straightened beside him, but not toward him, away from him. Gideon opened the portfolio and removed 3 folders, each marked with a date. "Outdated?" he said. "Then perhaps the board would prefer recent material." He handed the first folder to the nearest trustee. Inside were internal emails showing Celeste approving press language that linked Vivian's name to financial irregularities before any formal review had begun. The second folder contained reimbursement records, private transfers, and consultant payments routed through image management accounts tied to Celeste's office. The third was worse. Text messages, Naomi's messages, screenshots proving she had fed Harrison private details about Vivian's health, grief counseling, and the unsigned restructuring papers designed to strip her authority. Naomi made a sound Vivian had never heard from her before, not crying, collapse. "No," Naomi whispered. "He said this was temporary." Harrison turned on her instantly. "Be quiet." And that was his mistake, because the whole room heard the command in his real voice, sharp, contemptuous, stripped of charm. Reporters surged forward. Donors stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. Celeste stepped back as if distance itself might save her. Vivian did not look at Naomi. That grief could wait. She looked only at Harrison. For years he had made her doubt her memory, her instincts, her worth. But now his mask was cracking under the weight of documents, witnesses, and his own panic. Then the trustee at the front opened the final page, looked up at Gideon, and asked, "If these findings are verified, who takes control now?" By the time the trustee finished the last page, the ballroom no longer belonged to Harrison. It belonged to the truth. The donors who had once hovered around him like satellites now leaned away, whispering to attorneys, assistants, and spouses. Reporters moved with open hunger, no longer chasing scandal about a fragile wife, but a far bigger story. A public philanthropist accused of using fraud, manipulation, and reputational sabotage to seize control of a legacy that was never truly his. Harrison sensed the shift and made one final attempt to command the room. "This is absurd," he said, stepping forward with the old authority still clinging to his posture. "No board takes action based on theatrics and half-read documents. I built this foundation. I brought in the donors. I made this gala matter." "No," said a voice from table 6. It was Bernard Whitmore, one of the foundation's oldest benefactors, a man who had funded hospitals, libraries, and 3 political campaigns without ever needing his picture in the paper. He rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and looked straight at Harrison. "You monetized the foundation," Bernard said. "She gave it dignity." A murmur swept through the ballroom. Then another donor stood, then another. One woman requested her pledge be frozen immediately pending review. A technology sponsor instructed his chief counsel to suspend all future partnership discussions. A couple from Boston quietly removed their names from the gala underwriting wall before dessert was even served. Each decision hit Harrison harder than shouting ever could. Celeste tried to slip toward the side exit, but two reporters intercepted her with questions about media payments and donor manipulation. She offered polished denials, but the confidence was gone. Across the room, Naomi sat in a chair she had not chosen, trembling, ignored by everyone she had once tried so desperately to impress. And then the board chair took the microphone. "Effective immediately," she announced, "Mr. Harrison Vale is suspended from all executive authority pending emergency investigation. All Sterling-linked assets, donor permissions, and naming rights are frozen until transfer review is complete." The room erupted, phones lit up, messages flew. One financial journalist was already dictating a headline into her recorder. Harrison turned toward Vivian then, not with remorse, but disbelief, as if he still could not understand how the woman he had dismissed for years had become the force that ended him in a single night. Vivian held his gaze without flinching. She did not smile. That would have been too small for what this was. This was not revenge anymore. It was consequence. And as security stepped toward Harrison, his phone began vibrating with the first call from federal investigators. The morning after the gala, Vivian woke before sunrise in the penthouse that no longer felt like a cage. For the first time in years, the silence around her was not oppressive. It was clean. No messages from Harrison, no carefully staged concern from Celeste, no soft, poisonous advice from Naomi telling her to stay calm while her life was being stolen in pieces. Just pale winter light slipping across the floors and the faint sound of the city waking below her. By 9 o'clock, the legal transfer review had already begun. Gideon met her in the trust office with coffee, 3 updated folders, and the same steady presence that had carried her through the longest night of her life. He didn't offer hollow comfort. He offered facts which felt kinder. "The board voted unanimously," he said. "Your authority has been restored. The Sterling Family Trust is back under direct air control. The penthouse, the foundation naming rights, the donor network access, all of it." Vivian stood still, absorbing the words one at a time. All of it. Not because anyone pitied her. Not because a man decided to save her, because it had always been hers, and now the world had been forced to admit it. By noon, the consequences spread further. Harrison's accounts were frozen pending investigation. His invitations to 2 major charity councils were revoked. 3 sponsors issued public statements distancing themselves from his leadership. Celeste was placed under review for coordinated media manipulation and unauthorized payments. Naomi, abandoned by everyone she had betrayed Vivian to impress, sent 6 messages and received no reply. That afternoon, Vivian returned to the foundation offices. The same employees who had once looked through her now stood when she entered. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Others looked relieved, as if the truth had finally given them permission to breathe. Vivian did not humiliate any of them. She simply walked to the executive conference room, took the seat at the head of the table, and began. "We are going to rebuild this properly," she said. "No more image without integrity, no more loyalty purchased by fear." And for the first time, the room listened because it was her voice, not Harrison's, that carried authority. When the meeting ended, Gideon waited by the window. "You have your name back," he said. Vivian looked at him, then out across the city she had once moved through like a ghost. "No," she answered softly. "I have more than that now." Because beyond the glass, beyond the scandal, beyond the wreckage Harrison had left behind, something new was finally beginning. And when Gideon asked if she was ready to go home, Vivian realized home would never mean the same thing again. 3 months later, spring arrived quietly in Manhattan. The papers had moved on by then. Harrison Vale was no longer a man photographed on red carpets. He was a cautionary headline, a former golden name tied to investigations, frozen assets, and the kind of public disgrace money could not smooth over. Celeste had disappeared from the charity circuit completely, her polished image shattered by the records that proved she had sold loyalty for access. Naomi, left with nothing but silence from the circles she once fought to enter, sent one final apology Vivian never answered. Some endings did not need conversation. They needed distance. Vivian stood on the terrace of the restored Sterling house, the original family property now reopened as the headquarters for a redesigned foundation, not a vanity project, not a performance for donors. A real institution focused on widows, women rebuilding after financial abuse, and families pushed aside by polished people with dangerous smiles. Below her, the courtyard was filled with soft lights, white roses, and guests who had been invited for the right reasons, not for photographs. The event tonight was small by Manhattan standards, but it meant more than any gala she had ever planned beside Harrison. This room, this mission, this piece belonged to her. Inside, laughter drifted through the open doors. Vivian turned as Gideon stepped onto the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He still wore dark suits, still spoke with that steady calm that made chaos feel smaller. But somewhere over the last 3 months, the distance between them had changed. He no longer stood beside her like a witness. He stood beside her like a future. "You should come in," he said. "They're waiting for the founder." Vivian smiled. "That still feels strange." "It won't for long." She took the glass from his hand. Their fingers brushed, and neither of them looked away. For years, Vivian had believed being chosen meant being loved. Harrison had taught her how false that was. Real love did not reduce. It did not erase. It did not ask her to disappear so someone else could shine. Gideon reached into his jacket, and for one suspended second, Vivian's breath caught. Not because she needed saving, not because her life would only be complete with a ring, but because this time whatever was offered would come with truth. He opened a small velvet box. "Vivian Sterling," he said softly, "would you let me build a life with you that never asks you to be less than you are?" Her eyes filled before the answer reached her lips. Yes. And as the lights glowed behind them, and the city shimmered beyond the terrace, Vivian understood at last. The woman he humiliated on the red carpet had not been destroyed that night. She had been introduced to the life she was always meant to have. 6 months after the engagement, Vivian no longer checked the news to see whether Harrison's name had disappeared. It had, not in one dramatic collapse, but in the slow, humiliating way real consequences often happened. His remaining partners had withdrawn one by one. The Federal Review turned into formal charges tied to misrepresentation, misuse of restricted funds, and falsified disclosures connected to the foundation years. The men who once called him brilliant now called him reckless. The women who once admired Celeste now said they had always found her cold. Society had done what society does best. It rewrote its memory to survive the embarrassment of having applauded the wrong people. Vivian did not need revenge anymore because life had already delivered something better. distance. On a warm May afternoon, she stood inside the new counselling wing of Sterling House, watching sunlight spill across pale oak floors and shelves lined with legal guides, recovery workbooks, and framed photos from the Foundation's first months under her leadership. Every room had been designed with intention, no performance, no vanity, just dignity. A woman in her early 50s stepped out of one of the offices and stopped when she saw Vivian. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, voice unsteady. "I thought losing my marriage meant losing my whole life. Then I found this place." Vivian smiled gently. "You found yourself. We just opened the door." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes before leaving. That moment stayed with Vivian long after the hallway emptied, because for years she had believed survival was the prize. Endure the insult, endure the loneliness, endure the shrinking of your own life until peace returned. But peace never came that way. It only came when she stopped protecting the people who benefited from her silence. That evening, the staff gathered in the courtyard for a small celebration marking the Foundation's expansion into 3 new cities. Gideon stood near the garden lights, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, laughing with people who respected him not because he was powerful, but because he was decent. When he crossed the courtyard and took Vivian's hand, it felt wonderfully ordinary. Not a rescue, not a spectacle, a choice. "Ready?" he asked. Vivian looked around at the life she had rebuilt, at the people healing inside walls that now carried her family name with honesty, and then back at the man beside her. This time, her answer came without fear. "Yes," she said, "to all of it, because the greatest ending was never Harrison's downfall. It was Vivian finally living a life no one could take from her again." The wedding took place on a September evening beneath the courtyard lights of Sterling House, with no press, no sponsor wall, and no red carpet. Vivian had been offered all 3. The city's social pages would have paid dearly for photos of her return, for a glimpse of the woman who had once been publicly humiliated and then calmly rebuilt everything in front of the same society that had dismissed her. But Vivian wanted no spectacle attached to this day. She had spent too many years living inside rooms built for appearance. Now she wanted something quieter, something true. White roses climbed the stone arch at the end of the garden path. A quartet played softly near the fountain. The guest list was small, chosen with care instead of strategy. Women whose lives had been changed by the Foundation sat beside old family friends, trusted staff, and a handful of donors who had stayed when staying carried risk. It was the first elegant event Vivian had hosted in years that felt completely free of performance. She stood in a silk gown that did not try to make her look younger, thinner, or more fragile than she was. It simply made her look like herself, strong, graceful, entire. When Gideon turned and saw her walking toward him, something in his face shifted so openly that Vivian had to steady her breath. No calculation, no image, no possession, just love and the quiet awe of a man who knew exactly who stood before him. The vows were simple. He promised never to confuse silence with weakness. She promised never to disappear inside love again. He promised honesty, even when truth was uncomfortable. She promised partnership, not sacrifice disguised as devotion. When they exchanged rings, the courtyard lights glowed against the gathering dusk, and for one suspended moment, Vivian felt the full weight of the years behind her, the betrayal, the humiliation, the long season of doubting herself. It had all led here, not to prove suffering was noble, but to prove it did not get the last word. After the ceremony, as laughter rose around them and music drifted into the night air, Vivian stepped briefly to the edge of the courtyard and looked out over the city skyline. Once, those lights had reminded her of how small she felt. Now they looked different. Now they looked like witness. And when Gideon came to stand beside her, slipping his hand into hers with the ease of something earned rather than claimed, Vivian smiled without bitterness, without fear, without needing anyone else to see it. Because the happiest ending was not marrying a good man, it was becoming a woman who would never again accept less than the life, love, and respect she deserved. A year later, on the night of the Winter Legacy Gala, Vivian returned to the same hotel where Harrison had once tried to erase her in front of the world. The red carpet was still there, the cameras were still flashing, the chandeliers still spilled gold across polished marble. But everything else was different. This time, the invitation bore her full name alone: Vivian Sterling Cross, chair of the Sterling Foundation. Not as someone's wife. Not as a silent figure standing just outside the frame. As the woman whose work had rebuilt the institution from the inside out and turned it into something worthy of respect. When the Rolls-Royce stopped at the curb, the driver opened the door, and Vivian stepped out beside Gideon. The crowd straightened with a different kind of attention. No pity, no gossip, no hungry curiosity waiting for a woman to break. What met her now was recognition. Reporters called her name. Donors moved forward to greet her. Women she had never met smiled at her with the quiet gratitude of people who knew exactly what she had survived. For a moment, Vivian stood at the edge of the carpet and looked up at the entrance where Harrison had once said, "She's not with me tonight." How small that sentence seemed now, how desperate, how temporary. Inside the ballroom, the evening opened with a short film about the Foundation's first year under her leadership. Families helped, legal aid expanded, recovery housing funded, counseling centers opened, scholarships created for women rebuilding their lives after financial and emotional abuse. The applause at the end was long, not because the room was being polite, but because the work had touched something real. Later, when Vivian stepped onto the stage, she did not speak about revenge. She did not mention Harrison, Celeste, Naomi, or the night her life had split in two. She simply looked out at the room and said, "Dignity is not something the world gives you. It is something you stop surrendering." The crowd rose to its feet. At the back of the ballroom, near the same doors where whispers once followed her like knives, Gideon watched with quiet pride. Vivian met his eyes and smiled, then looked back at the room that had once witnessed her humiliation and now witnessed her victory. Not loud, not cruel, not borrowed from anyone else, earned. And as the applause rolled through the grand old ballroom, Vivian finally understood the deepest truth of all. The red carpet had never been where her life changed. It changed the moment she decided that losing the wrong man was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her worth. 2 weeks after the gala, a letter arrived at Sterling House with no return address and Harrison's name written across the front in the tight, expensive handwriting he had once used on anniversary cards he clearly did not mean. Vivian stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was one page, no apology, no confession, no sudden awakening of conscience. Just the familiar language of a man who still believed control could be rebuilt if he sounded reasonable enough. He wrote that events had spiraled beyond anyone's intentions. He claimed Celeste had manipulated more than he realized. He suggested Naomi had fed false impressions into an already tense situation. He admitted to mistakes in judgment, but never once named cruelty for what it was. At the bottom, in a final line that made Vivian almost laugh, he asked to meet privately for the sake of closure. Closure. as if closure was something he could schedule between lawyers. Vivian folded the letter once, neatly, and set it on her desk. Gideon, reviewing case updates across from her, looked up but did not ask to read it. That was one of the things she loved most about him. He never reached for wounds that were not offered. "Harrison?" he asked. Vivian nodded. "And?" "He still thinks the problem was exposure," she said quietly. "Not what he did." Gideon leaned back in his chair. That tends to be how men like him understand suffering. If they feel it, it matters. If they cause it, it becomes context. Vivian let that settle. The next morning, she gave the letter to her attorney with one instruction: no meeting, no private call, no response beyond formal channels, not out of anger, out of completion, because that was the thing Harrison had never understood. The opposite of love was not hatred, it was freedom. That afternoon, Vivian walked through the lower west wing of Sterling House, where a new legal resource centre had just opened. Women sat in bright rooms with advocates, accountants, and counsellors, rebuilding papers, accounts, names, and futures. One of them stopped Vivian in the hallway and said, "I watched your speech. It made me leave." Vivian touched her arm gently. "Then you've already done the hardest part." As evening fell, she returned to her office and looked out over the courtyard below, where lights glowed softly against the stone, and late roses still held their colour. Harrison wanted closure, but closure was not a conversation with the man who broke her. It was the quiet, beautiful life she built after finally refusing to let him define the ending. On the first anniversary of the night everything broke, Vivian stood alone for a few quiet minutes in the front hall of Sterling House before the guests arrived. The building was warm with lamplight, polished wood, and the soft movement of staff making final preparations for the Foundation's annual Dignity Dinner. It was not the old gala anymore. Vivian had ended that tradition the moment she took control. No donor vanity parade, no staged photo line built to flatter people who confuse generosity with performance. This evening honored women who had rebuilt their lives after betrayal, coercion, financial abuse, and public shame. Real courage, real restoration, real legacy. She ran her fingertips lightly across the edge of the entry table, grounding herself in the present. 1 year ago, at almost this exact hour, she had been standing outside another ballroom while Harrison tried to erase her in front of cameras. She could still remember the sting of cold air on her skin, the silence after his words, the sound of the Rolls-Royce pulling to the curb. Back then she thought her life was ending. Now she understood it had only been stripped down to truth. Behind her, footsteps crossed the marble floor. Gideon stopped beside her, not speaking right away. He had learned that some moments did not need to be filled. His hand found hers, warm and steady, and she turned to look at him. "You're thinking about that night," he said. Vivian smiled faintly. "I am." "With regret?" She looked around the hall, at the framed photographs of new scholarship recipients, at the names of partner shelters engraved in brass, at the program for tonight's event, where her name appeared not as decoration, but as founder, chair, and witness to what survival could become. "No," she said, "not anymore." The doors opened. Guests began to arrive. Women who had once entered this house frightened and uncertain now returned with children, new jobs, restored credit, apartments of their own, and laughter that no longer sounded borrowed. One of them hugged Vivian and whispered, "Because of this place, my daughter will grow up seeing strength, not fear." Vivian closed her eyes for 1 second, letting the words settle deep. That was the reward, not society's approval, not even justice, though justice had come. It was this: a life made useful from pain, a future made larger than betrayal, a love built on truth, a name restored with purpose. Then Vivian lifted her chin, stepped forward into the glowing room, and welcomed everyone inside. Because the final victory was never making Harrison watch her rise. It was building a life so full of meaning that his fall no longer mattered at all. And that brings this story to a close, my wonderful friends. If you are still here with me right now, then Ashbin, something in this story probably touched your heart in a very personal way. Maybe it was Vivian's pain, maybe it was her silence, or maybe it was the moment she finally understood that losing the wrong people can be the beginning of finding yourself. The deeper lesson here is that healing often begins when we stop begging for fairness from those who benefit from our suffering. As Ayn Rand once wrote, the question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me. And in a quieter emotional sense, that truth matters. Your worth does not shrink just because someone failed to see it. Your dignity is not something others hand to you. It is something you protect, even after heartbreak. This story reminds us that betrayal may wound a person deeply, but it does not have to define the rest of their life. Sometimes the most powerful kind of healing is choosing peace, truth, and self-respect over bitterness. If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what part of Vivian's journey spoke to your heart the most? This story is a fictional dramatic narrative created for storytelling and entertainment purposes. While it reflects real emotional experiences such as betrayal, healing, dignity, and personal growth, the characters, events, organizations, and situations in this video are imagined or creatively adapted. It is not presented as news, documentary reporting, or a factual record of any real person's life. The purpose of this content is to share meaningful life lessons through drama in a way that feels relatable and emotionally honest to viewers. Any resemblance to actual people, businesses, or events is purely coincidental or used in a general fictional sense. We value truthful content and want to be clear that this channel focuses on inspirational storytelling, emotional reflection, and life-based fiction designed to encourage viewers, not mislead them. If this story gave you comfort, insight, or strength, please support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing so we can continue bringing you heartfelt stories with purpose.